Dr. Lionel Corbett has served as a military physician and became a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 1974. He's done research into the biochemistry of the brain, began one of the first programs in the psychology of aging, was hospital director of inpatient psychiatry, trained as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute in Chicago, helped found a training program for Jungian analysts in Santa Fe, has studied Christian and Jewish mysticism, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and yoga, and has founded here at Pacifica the Psyche and the Sacred program. He is the author of 5 books, several training films, and over 40 professional articles. And the books include The Religious Function of the Psyche, Psyche and the Sacred, Spirituality Beyond Religion, The Sacred Cauldron, Psychotherapy as a Spiritual Practice, and The Soul in Anguish, Psychotherapeutic Approaches to Suffering. Dr. Corbett teaches in various programs here, including the Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices program. So with that, please welcome Dr. Lionel Corbett.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about some psychological approaches to the problem of evil. I guess, given what's going on in the world, I don't need to explain why this is an important topic. I want to say at the beginning that there can't be any overarching theory about the nature of evil, because there are too many different types of evil. And in any given situation, if we try and define it too rigidly, we tend to leave out other types of evil. And so we always need to look at a combination of factors to understand any given instance of evil. What I want to do this evening is talk about some psychoanalytic ideas, some Jungian ideas, and some ideas from social psychology about evil, and see if any of this comes together. Before I try to get into notions about where evil comes from, I want to acknowledge that there are many people nowadays who say that evil is ultimately inexpressible and inexplicable, beyond reason and beyond explanation, because it's really impossible for us to understand how anyone could carry out an act like the murder of children in a cold-blooded kind of way. I don't think we can afford to take a position like that, because it would leave us with nothing to do in response to the problem. So I think we have to look at evil in terms of a combination of psychological and social factors. Social factors are just as important. The situation that the individual, the social situation that the individual is in, becomes as important sometimes as what's going on in the mind of the perpetrator of evil. I'm thinking of social factors like those that contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s, and so on, as well as intrapsychic dynamics and shadow complexes and so on, which are going on in the mind. Now, there's an important caveat. Many people have objected to any discussion about the psychology of evil because they say, if you start explaining why somebody behaves in an evil manner, you somehow imply that the person is not responsible. You take him off the hook. There are some objections, especially from historians and theologians, to try to understand the psychology of Hitler, for example. Emil Fackenheim, a very distinguished historian, said, only God can understand it. We don't understand the psychology of people like that. And if we start to try to explain what happened to this character in his childhood and in his social situation, all of a sudden he becomes a victim, and we remove the perpetrator's responsibility. So that's a concern. If the perpetrator was severely abused in childhood and now becomes an abuser himself, does that mean he's less responsible for his actions? That's one of the main anxieties. I don't think it's a realistic fear, because to understand an evil act in terms of the psychology and social situation is certainly not the same as to pardon it, and it doesn't reduce the horror of the act. If you want to treat a disease, you best understand it as deeply as possible. So I don't think that's a real concern. I don't think the psychological and social approach to evil bypasses the moral dimensions of evil. But I always have to say that at the beginning because many people are concerned that it does. If we can demonstrate major developmental disasters in the childhood of an evil person, such as abandonment and abuse, sometimes these might be mitigating factors legally, but that doesn't mean that in any sense the perpetrator is less responsible. It's often called the abuse excuse nowadays in the legal system, because we recognize that many people have horrendous childhood environments but don't commit evil. So the abuse excuse by itself doesn't work. And we're very careful not to lessen the reality of evil by giving it some kind of psychological explanation. We don't want to condone evil by saying it's a kind of sickness, even though I personally think it is a kind of sickness, because those would affect the issue of responsibility, and we do have to hold people responsible in order to have a working social system. So we can try to understand evil and also morally condemn it at the same time. But this issue of personal responsibility and free will is always hovering in the background. There is a tendency among some psychologists to be very cautious about using the word evil. Some people want to get rid of the word evil because it traditionally has religious connotations. And so, for example, the psychoanalysts will say that when we talk about the devil, we're talking about the reification and projection of intrapsychic dynamics. The devil is really something in the mind of the perpetrator. It's not an external figure. The classic example of that would be in the biblical book of Job, where the story of Job begins with the devil and God, Satan and God meeting. And Satan says to God, Job is not as pious as he looks because he's just pious and good, because you've given him all this good stuff. If you were to take away all this good stuff, he wouldn't be so pious and good. And so God and Satan have a bet about that, the god of the wager. But if we think about Satan psychologically and mythically rather than literally as an actual figure, this would represent something in Job's mind, an internal persecutor, an internal figure or complex in Job's mind that's accusing Job of not being as pious as he looks on the outside. So that's the kind of way in which psychologists think of figures like the devil. Freud had a famous case of demonical possession where the devil turned out to be the patient's father and so on. Those are typical ways of dealing with that figure. Now, there are obvious conscious factors as well as unconscious factors that predispose to evil. The obvious conscious factors are factors such as envy and hatred and narcissism, the need to enhance oneself at the expense of others. And I'll talk a little bit about the problem of malignant narcissism. The desire to have more for oneself relative to others, the desire for power, which is a potent cause of evil, a threat to one's image of oneself, hatred of those who seem to have more than I have, extremism, fundamentalism, the belief that there's a single absolute truth and anyone who doesn't believe it deserves to die, and so on. The violent hatred and rejection of anything different than me, those are all relatively conscious sources of evil. The problem for the psychologist is, where do these kind of mental states come from? What are their sources in the psyche and in the culture? Lots of psychologists and psychoanalysts want to equate evil with psychopathology. They will say that we all have the potential to commit evil. We all have, because we all have pockets or residues of infantile childhood trauma, what are called in psychoanalysis persecutory internal objects or bad internal objects, or what Jung calls the shadow, some dark side of the personality that results from childhood abuse or neglect or mistreatment and so on. But most of us, who, even if we have those sectors in our personality, we can restrain those aspects of ourselves without acting them out. too much. So why do some people find it impossible to restrain these sectors of the personality? So for that, we need to move into the psychology of the unconscious. This has led to a conflict between depth psychologists and theologians. For example, what theologians will often call sin, the psychologists will say, that's just a word that avoids the understanding the complex human motivations that are involved in human behavior. So, for example, if a man has a terror of being alone and a fear of the dark, and feels abandoned and miserable, and he's in his apartment at night, it's getting darker and darker, he's feeling more and more panicky, more and more anxious. And so the only way he can control his mounting despair and panic is to go to a bar, pick somebody up and have sort of a random sexual encounter. And this is a typical kind of problem that happens to him over and over again. This is an actual case that I'm thinking of. And he goes to his minister, and the minister says this, he has to stop this because this behavior is sinful. That's the kind of situation that drives psychologists crazy, because we know that this kind of very severe abandonment depression and severe separation anxiety drives people, is first of all unconscious. It just produces a conscious sensation of intolerable panic. But the person is not aware of the underpinnings of the behavior. And so the theologian or the minister will call this sinful. The psychologist will have an entirely different explanation for it. So that's what I mean when I say that we have to take into account the unconscious sources of this kind of behavior. A man has a compulsion to, once or twice a year, to visit a prostitute and to tie her up and behave in an extremely abusive way towards her, in a very hateful manner. And only in that way can he manage to have sex with her. Again, his minister tells him that this is terrible behavior, he has to stop it, but he's not a psychopath. He's full of shame, he's full of remorse, he knows this is bad behavior, but he's driven by an internal unconscious compulsion. In this case, this was a man who was frequently abandoned as a child, and grew to hate and be enormously enraged with his caregivers who would repeatedly abandon him. So what he did with this prostitute was to enact the rage and fear and hatred that he was feeling for his childhood abandoning caretakers. So this was an enactment based on something that was being driven by unconscious factors that he had no control over, and calling it sinful, quote unquote, is actually not much helpful, not any help to him at all, just makes him feel worse. That's what I mean when I talk about the conflict between a simple moral judgment of behavior and taking into account unconscious factors. So there seem to be positive forms of evil, like deliberate sadism, where somebody enjoys being cruel or hateful to somebody else, which is often the result of having been treated that way as a child. And there are negative forms of evil that result from neglect in childhood, or ignorance, or unavoidable deprivation. But whatever the origin of the problem, the consequences for the personality are very far-reaching. Much evil behavior arises from these kind of relational failures or disruptions, and failure to repair these disruptions in childhood. The story seems to be that severe emotional deprivation and trauma in childhood leads to deficits in the structure of the personality, the structure of the sense of self, that make the individual really fragile. And this fragility, because of resulting from the emotional deprivation, predisposes to hostility or repression. From a Jungian point of view, this kind of childhood difficulty produces complexes, what we call complexes, which allow the incarnation of the dark side of the self. And so the person is living out an incarnate aspect of the dark side of the self. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So that means that from Jung's point of view, there is a transpersonal dimension of evil and a human level of evil, but the two are intimately linked. You wouldn't have one without the other. If there hadn't been the childhood deprivation or abuse, there would be no way in which the dark side of the self could incarnate into the personality. This is the way that some Jungians try and reconcile the human and the transpersonal dimensions of evil. So the absence of goodness in childhood doesn't remain an absence. It leads to later destructiveness. It's as if this absence allows evil behavior to arise that would otherwise never be activated, but it does exist as a potential. And then once this pattern takes hold, the individual gets caught in an escalating cycle of behavior that's difficult to control and very harmful to everybody. Now, I mentioned that there are too many forms of evil to define it precisely. And different cultures at different historical periods have thought about evil in their own ways. So, for example, not so very long ago in terms of human history, slavery was not regarded as an evil. It was accepted as culturally normal. Nowadays, we would acknowledge that behavior is an evil. And there are many instances like that that are defined by culture. There are common sense definitions of evil. Whatever produces human sorrow unnecessarily, whatever inflicts needless harm, whatever is unnecessarily destructive or violent, anything that curtails personal growth and human potential, anything that destroys relationships. So the question that arises then, people will say, well, okay, in that case, are there absolute standards? If there are these cultural standards, if that's your list of what our culture would acknowledge as evil, are there absolute standards of evil? Is evil simply behavior that we in our culture regard as particularly horrifying? Is there really an archetypal or transpersonal level of evil, like in mythologies of the devil? And most religious traditions have some equivalent figure to the devil. Or Jung has the notion of the dark side of the self, the dark side of the God image. And if there is some kind of mythological figure like that, then does evil have a teleological purpose? Is it aiming at some goal or other? The other question that arises is whether evil in that case is a kind of a property of the universe, a natural function. Some people will say no, it's purely a matter of human bad behavior. Other people will say no, evil is kind of a natural constant, like the law of gravity. It's just built into the fabric of the universe. This is a debate that's never really been resolved. But the people who don't think there's any such thing as naturally occurring evil will say that evil is always the result of psychopathology or social pathology. Other people will say no, there are levels of evil that defy explanation, and that's why we need metaphysical explanations like the devil or the dark side of God. But if evil has some kind of supernatural origin, like the devil or the dark side of God, then it cannot be fully understood by human beings, and we wouldn't be able to deal with it without divine help. In contrast, if evil is purely a matter of social or individual psychopathology, then we don't really need the word evil. We can just describe bad behavior. We can say this is cruel or sadistic behavior. Then we would say that evil has no independent ontological reality. It's purely a matter of the result of child abuse and so on. There are lots of writers nowadays who say that we shouldn't use the word evil because it's inherently demonizing. It would be better just to describe in a clinical kind of way the problem behavior. Let's just say this is hateful, cruel behavior. Other people say we need the word evil because if we don't use the word evil, we minimize the gravity of the offense that we're trying to understand. And we need a word that expresses the horror that we experience when we see evil. The problem that arises here then is what's the difference between something that's just wrong and something that's truly evil? Where do you draw the line exactly? There are some things that we do are just wrong or selfish, but you wouldn't really call them evil. There are ordinary human failings. Excuse me. So do we need evil to describe words behavior that's worse than just bad or destructive. I would say that we need a word that describes how we feel when we see an action that produces a kind of visceral revulsion, kind of a feeling of disgust and horror, that just saying bad or wrong won't be sufficient to describe something like that. We need something that describes the horrific quality of the action. So that when you call somebody evil, it's important to remember that you're condemning them in a very special way. You're not just saying the person is immoral or doing something wrong. So then the question arises, is evil some quality of a person, or is it only a quality of an action of the person? In other words, is the person evil, or is what he does evil? Can an evil act be carried out by somebody who doesn't have an evil character? Well, it seems likely that you could be an evil character, but just not be in a position to carry out an evil action. Presumably Hitler would have been an evil character, even if he'd never come to power. So there's a problem here about saying a person is evil in a way that condemns what he is, not simply what he does. That's an important distinction. It's also possible that an ordinary person who's not normally evil could carry out a very evil act under extreme circumstances that's out of character. I hope this doesn't sound too nitpicking, but it always irritates me when politicians use the word evil in very simplistic ways. You remember Reagan's evil empire and Bush's axis of evil, and these are examples of the word being used in a very simplistic, self-righteous kind of manner. Because to call somebody else evil or another country evil is to imply that we are entitled to attack them, as if we are all good and they are entirely demonic. This is a defense known as primitive splitting, and it's unfortunately fairly common, especially among our politicians. The problem is that once you start calling people evil, you stop trying to understand them. And you oversimplify the situation, you oversimplify the relationship. All the nuances get wiped out in this black and white, good and evil distinction. There are people who will distinguish between what are called moral monsters and moral idiots. A moral monster is a personality who doesn't act because it's wrong and who takes pleasure in doing it. He shows no morally appropriate shame or guilt or regret. So these are relatively rare people, but of course they do occur. There are other people who are the moral idiots who are just thoughtless, who just don't realize what they're doing. Now, I mentioned that we can define evil as the intentional infliction of pain and suffering on another person, but I should qualify that by saying that it's not enough to define evil in terms of harm and suffering caused to other people, because one could be an evil person without causing suffering. One could be evil in the sense that one enjoys watching the suffering of other people. If you had a character like Hitler who was, say, tetraplegic, who was confined to his bed and was completely unable to move, he might be having all kinds of evil fantasies but not be able to do anything, but you might consider him still to be evil rather than bad. So you have to take, some people say you have to take into account motive, and some people say you have to take into account whether harm is caused. The criterion of harm is not a very good one, because some people cause harm without any intention of doing so. And of course, we always assume that an evil person is somebody who's morally responsible for what they're doing. So this would exclude people who are psychotic or insane or severely mentally ill. An evil act by an insane person would be akin to a natural disaster, like an earthquake or something. That person would not be considered to be morally responsible. To be considered to be evil, a person has to act knowingly, with foresight, deliberation, planning, not just recklessly or negligently. The perpetrator's motive has to be something like sadism or racism. A person who commits an evil action in a moment of weakness or frenzy is not necessarily an evil person. He may not have an evil character. It's also not enough to think of evil in terms of aggression or violence. Especially, some people define evil as deliberate, indefensible violence against innocent people. But evil cannot be completely equated with aggression or with violence, because there are evil actions that are more subtle and more complicated than violence. It might be possible to act in an evil way by oppressing other people or by exploiting other people, using other people for one's own benefit, for the sake of pleasure, to force or humiliate other people. So violence itself doesn't cover forms of psychological cruelty that are distinctly evil. Now, I've mentioned that many people today think we don't need a classical metaphysical notion of evil like the devil, and that we should think in terms of clinical categories like sadism or a set of symptoms. There are still some people who want to talk about the devil, however. So there's a big divide between the materialists and the religionists in this area. The materialists see the universe as neutral or indifferent to human beings, and they will say that what we call evil is just a matter of unpleasant reality. It's just a part of the way things are, the tragic side of life. And they would say that if you use a word like the devil, you're just being mythological or superstitious. An earthquake or something has no moral qualities. Other people say, no, we need a term like the devil, or what Jung calls the dark side of the self, because we want to convey the intensity of the experience. Mythic images give evil special meaning, and notions like the devil are useful because they preserve the element of mystery and the imagination. There are many mythic examples of where this is handy. The one that came to mind as I was writing this was the story of the Gorgon, of the Medusa, who was so evil that her face turned people to stone. And Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom, gave Perseus a shield so that he could approach Medusa and see her as a reflected image rather than directly. This is a very useful myth which tells us that sometimes it's too difficult to face evil without some kind of psychological or theological or philosophical shield that acts as a way to reflect on it. These kinds of mythic images are quite powerful, and they take us beyond what can be expressed using just ordinary rational thought. There's some concern that if we try to be too scientific in our accounts of evil without using mythological metaphors, we end up being a little bit too reductive about the problem of evil. But the opposite point of view is that we should try and get rid of the notion of the devil or some kind of hidden spiritual force, and just think of evil in terms of social science and psychological science. And they would say that the word evil implies too much of a moral obsolete. This is an obsolete, a moral absolute, and that this is an obsolete hangover from simplistic religious thinking. So there are people who have brain changes that make them unable to experience empathy or caring for other people. In that case, evil is a medical condition, and we know lots of causes of damage to the empathic ability. We know that psychopaths have no capacity for empathy. We know that narcissistic defenses prevent empathy. Empathy is depressed or suppressed because to imagine and feel what another person is going through wakens our own suffering too much, and the suffering of those who are close to us. So defenses in this context are very important. Splitting and dissociation or psychic numbing, make ordinary people more able to commit evil by reducing our empathic awareness of what we're doing to other people. One only has to think of the way we don't think about factory farming or processes like that that cause a great deal of suffering. And the way we don't think about them is by employing these kind of splitting defenses. So indifference to evil is an enormous problem. But the empathy notion is not the whole story, because there are sadistic people who enjoy being cruel to other people, and they use their empathy to enjoy the suffering of their victims. So again, this is an example of something that this lack of empathy theory, which is a major theory in the field nowadays, as an explanation for why people can commit evil, is not a complete explanation. It's also not complete to think about intention and motivation as important criteria. There are people who think that you have to call an action evil, you have to consider the intention or the motivation that was driving the action. The problem with that is that in medieval times, the people who burned witches, the inquisitors who burned witches, had the purest motivation. Many of them thought they were doing the soul of the witch a favor. They were acting in accord with the will of God. They were fighting evil. So motivation and intention are very tricky problems. You can commit serious evil like that in the sincere belief or illusion that you're doing good. So many people say we can't use motive as a way of defining evil. An action might be evil apart from the motive of the perpetrator. And the motive might even be considered to be good by the perpetrator, and you can commit an evil action without intending to do so. So motivation alone doesn't work. A good example of that is terrorism. Terrorists are evil from the point of view of the victims of terrorism, but they regard themselves as freedom fighters or religious devotees or something like that. So from their point of view, their motivations are completely admirable. So it might be better to not take into account motivation and just shift our focus to the suffering of the victims. From this point of view, anything that deprives other people from the basics needed to live a decent life, adequate food, water, air, sleep, freedom, the ability to make choices, the ability to develop a sense of one's own sense of worth as a human being. Anything that deprives people from those things is evil. So then the question arises, well, can ordinary people commit evil? Does there have to be something wrong with you? Do you have to be a psychopath or a Nazi or something like that to commit evil? Is there something psychologically unique about evil people? Are they ordinary people in extraordinary situations? If that's the case, then what is the difference between the really evil people and the ordinary people? The classic example of this nowadays is that there were many ordinary Germans during the Hitler era who went along with the Holocaust. Were they lacking in self-awareness? Were they lacking in empathy? Were they fundamentally prone to violence that was released by a social situation like the Nazi regime? Was there an intrapsychic potential in those people because of child abuse or child-rearing practices in Germany at the time that just was released by the rise of the Nazi regime? Maybe evil is an intrapsychic potential that's released by social factors. One of the main examples given here is how ordinary middle-aged men in the Hamburg police force became savage murderers of the Jewish population of Poland in Eastern Europe, went round in killing squads, killing men, women, and children who were unarmed and harmless. And many of them, they were all offered the chance to be relieved of this duty. And there were no serious consequences if they were excused from this kind of duty, but very few of them backed out. They willingly committed terrible massacres, apparently out of obedience and peer pressure, not particularly because of hatred, but because of loyalty to their group. But they were said to be just ordinary men, ordinary policemen. Only about 12% of these people, of these mobile SS killing groups, killing units in Russia and Poland, were Nazis. Most of them were quote-unquote ordinary people. Now, it's true that this kind of work took a tremendous emotional toll on them. Many of them had to stay drunk all the time. They couldn't function if they weren't drunk. And the Nazi general who was in charge of these killing units actually broke down and had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. So this certainly takes a toll on apparently ordinary people. But most of the Nazis and most of the German population at the time were not particularly sadists or psychopathic personalities. On the other hand, they were not coerced into cooperating with the Nazis. If you look at the newsreels of the time, it's obvious that they were quite happy when Hitler first arose. They were not acting under duress. And many of them denounced their Jewish neighbors, even when they weren't coerced into doing so. So the population apparently was receptive to Nazi propaganda, probably because it coincided with prior attitudes, often based on centuries of anti-Jewish church propaganda, I'm afraid. But there was enormous support for the Nazis from the middle class and the social elite. So the Nazis were able to transform a population of apparently ordinary people into murderers. Again, either this is due to an evil core in the personality awaiting its opportunity, or evil arises by a series of natural processes by training people's minds in small steps. So ordinary social forces and propaganda were able to transform ordinary people into these murderers by inches, taking gradual small steps towards greater and greater atrocities. And the population increasingly caught up in this process, not realizing what was happening until it was too late. The reason I'm mentioning this particular historical period is that it's relevant to our own period. It's why we have to stand up to the very early potentials for this kind of behavior. So I said I would talk a little bit about the issue of malignant narcissism. This malignant narcissism is a term that was introduced in the 1960s by Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst who said that the malignant narcissist is really represents the quintessence of evil. He says this is the root of the most vicious destructiveness and inhumanity. So here's the description of the malignant narcissist, and you'll see its relevance as I describe it. All narcissistic character disorders are grandiose and need admiration and lack empathy. They are arrogant, they exaggerate their achievement and their abilities, and they want to be recognized as superior. They are preoccupied with fantasies of success and power and brilliance. They believe they are special and can only be understood by other special people. They need constant admiration, otherwise they get enraged. They are entitled. They have unreasonable expectations of favorable treatment. They have unreasonable expectations that other people will comply with their expectations. They exploit others in relationships. They are often envious, but the difficulty is that underneath all that, they have an unconscious sense of shame. So they have outward confidence and swagger and bluster, but internal shame. They have a terrible fear of humiliation, and this fear of humiliation will surface if their grandiosity is challenged. They need to feel powerful because as children, they were made to feel insignificant. I assume this is ringing some bells. So the theory is that they recapitulate with others the victimization that they once experienced as children. But now they are the victimizer, so they are doing to others what was done to them. They have a tremendously grandiose sense of self-importance, so they may not be in touch with their sense of inadequacy, with a kind of empty core. They are instead preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success and power and brilliance, a belief in being special and unique, a strong need for admiration. They have a tremendous sense of entitlement. They are exploitative interpersonally, and they are typically extremely envious of other people who seem successful. The envy is extremely important. They all have childhood experiences of severe narcissistic wounding and neglect, and they all have experienced complete lack of empathic parenting and often abandonment. So they're quite disturbed, quite sick people, and one has to have a certain degree of empathy for them, even though they're quite dangerous. Excuse me. So that's one of the main psychoanalytic approaches to this problem of people who can behave like that. Typically, the theory says that evil behavior is the result of trauma that's been internalized. This is a person who's been traumatized as a child and is now reenacting the trauma by making other people suffer the way the evildoer was made to suffer in childhood. I'm going to do to you what was done to me in childhood. The trauma of childhood is so severe that it can't be digested or assimilated, and so it's compulsively repeated in an attempt to expel it or evacuate it. So the persecutors from childhood are living on inside the personality, radically affecting the behavior. So cruel parenting leads to this kind of what we call introjective identification with tyrannical parents. So the individual, as they say, identifies with the aggressor. Excuse me. A failure of positive emotional nurturing in childhood leads to missing internal positive structures. I hope this makes sense to people who are not psychologists at the moment. This is the kind of stuff that you'll learn if you come to our program. And constant abuse of children is not only traumatic and terrifying, but leads to the internalization of rage and hostility that then expresses itself as the need for revenge. So every time one of these people is abusing somebody else, he or she is trying to get revenge on the people who were hurtful to the perpetrator. So the childhood experience of helplessness and being a victim is transformed into the domination of other people. And of course, if you've never experienced empathy, then you cannot ever develop the capacity to be empathic for other people. So your treatment of other people, it doesn't matter how you behave towards other people. If you sufficiently damage a child, you kill the self of the child. There are psychoanalysts who think that evil originates in the parental destruction of the true self of the child in infancy, leading to this kind of pathological narcissism that I've tried to describe. And that wants to destroy love and trust in other people as they were destroyed in the child when he was a child. All you're left with is a false self then that wants to destroy anything that's life-affirming. So it's as if the killer suffered a kind of psychological death in childhood by this infantile destruction of the true self of infancy, and wants to transform the other people into killed selves. I want to do to other people what was done to me. I want to kill people the way I was killed. This has been called by the writers in this area, establishing a companionship of the dead. The point that I want to make is that these, at the same time as these people have to be socially constrained and perhaps treated psychotherapeutically in some cases, we also have to have a great deal of compassion and remember that they didn't get like this for no reason at all. I just have a few minutes. So I've talked about the problem of definitions, some of the intrapsychic and psychodynamic factors. I wanted to talk about some of the social factors, the situational factors that predispose to evil behavior. Because there are social conditions that diminish people's dignity and diminish people's capacity to meet their basic needs. I mentioned briefly genocide. To commit genocide, large numbers of people in a population must be tacitly complicit. And there are certain social conditions which allow this to be perpetrated. And this is, in the literature, is called the situationist view. The situationist view of evil is that there are social conditions that make people commit evil. A particular social group feels hardship or humiliation or loss of control or threat, and that produces insecurity, and that leads to hostility to whoever seems to be responsible, and then tribalism takes over. Unfortunately, we are not very far removed from our early hominid ancestors who used to live in small groups of a few hundred people perhaps, and there was a great deal of conflict between these small tribal groups. So tribalism takes over when we're under threat. We have what's called predator anxiety. We have evolved with the capacity to be afraid of predators, both human and animals. So when tribalism takes over, where we see the other group as predatory, and we start to differentiate between us and them. Us being people who belong to my group, and them, the other group. And it doesn't matter whether you define the group by religion or ethnicity or race or nationality, but these divisions into us and them will often affect whether you treat somebody well or badly. And if you see them as them, it's okay to be violent, apparently. And if you see them as us, then we can be empathic and caring. So this problem arises a long time ago in our evolutionary history. It lies in what's called stranger anxiety. Stranger anxiety is the anxiety that we see in babies. In the first few months of life, the babies don't mind who's holding them. If they're being carefully, nicely held, they'll be quite comfortable. When they get towards the end of the first year of life, they get very afraid if they don't know the person who's holding them. They only trust people that they're familiar with. This is called stranger anxiety. And obviously this had some evolutionary significance in the past, because you wanted to be attached to your own tribe and not stray into other territories that could get you killed. So we become attached to our caretakers, and we're afraid of people we don't know. This is just part of our evolutionary heritage. If you're part of a group, that fosters a sense of identity and security, and your group's worldview becomes incorporated into your view of reality. And of course, the other thing that happens in cases of ethnic violence and genocide is that it's easier to treat people in a harmful way if you dehumanize them first. So government propaganda always dehumanizes the enemy, as if they have no personal identity or as if they are less than human. The psychoanalyst Erik Erikson called this pseudo-speciation. It's as if you treat the other person as if they were another species, which of course they're not. So the Bush administration is the classic example. Who they were able to mistreat captured terrorists by repeatedly referring to them as evildoers. as if that set them apart, as if they were a separate species. And this us and them psychology allows projection and scapegoating. So nationalism is another very toxic cause of in-group cohesion. It enhances self-esteem and it enhances our feeling about us, but it allows other groups to be persecuted. Now, one of the difficulties of thinking of evil at the large social level is that it displaces responsibility from the individual perpetrator. If I'm part of a large group that's persecuting a small group, scapegoating a small group, it doesn't matter whether it's the Jews, the witches, or the Catholics, or the Freemasons, so many groups have been scapegoated over the course of human history. I'm not responsible because my group is allowing me to do this, so my responsibility is diffused, and my superego, my conscience, takes on the conscience of the group, and I just do what everyone else thinks is right, and then I'm not responsible. There are, of course, always individuals who react with integrity in these situations. There were small numbers of people, for example, in Nazi Germany, who protected Jewish children at great risk to themselves and their own family. But they were a minority, and frankly, none of us know how we would behave if we grew up in a society like Nazi Germany and we were in that kind of situation where rescuing your neighbor might put your own life at risk. Now, I think the social scientists are overdoing their explanations. I don't think you can explain the behavior of somebody who walks into a church or a movie theater and kills people just in terms of their social environment. I think you have to take into account these people's intrapsychic structures. But the social psychologists insist on thinking of evil in terms of the social situation. They like to think in terms of the need for group acceptance, obedience to authority, social conformity, and those kind of pressures. They think that evil people are people who are caught up in very complex social forces. I don't know if you're familiar with the studies of Milgram and Zimbardo. Milgram was a Yale psychologist who was able to persuade undergraduate students to keep giving somebody what the student thought was severe, increasingly severe electric shocks by ordering the student to do it, even though the person who was actually an actor and not being shocked. But as far as the student was concerned, the student thought this person who was screaming in pain was actually getting electric shocks, and Milgram just made the students increase the shocks just by telling them to do it. This was an experiment to look into whether the insistence of an authority figure can make you behave in an evil way, and apparently it did. In 2/3 of the cases, only about 1/3 of the students were able to resist this pressure. So the question is, were these inherently sadistic people, and they were just put into a situation that allowed them to release this behavior? Or was this purely a situationist explanation? They were just behaving in a way that was socially appropriate to them. And you may remember the Zimbardo experiment at Stanford, where Philip Zimbardo set up a mock prison situation where groups of students either had to pretend to be guards or prisoners, and after about 6 days they had to shut the experiment down because it had become too realistic, and the prisoners, quote-unquote prisoners, were actually being abused. So the question is, can human nature be counted on to resist the pressure of brutal and inhumane authorities? A substantial number of people will do what they're told to do, irrespective of their conscience, if they think that the order comes from a legitimate authority. Right, so I said I'd go for an hour. So shall we stop at that point? And what's the plan? Needing a break?
Yeah, we'll have a 5-minute break, but keep going.
I'll keep have a break and keep going. But,
Go a little more and wind up.
Okay, well, I guess the other major point that I want to stress again is the role of psychological defenses. many of the people who committed atrocities in the Holocaust and in the Rwanda genocide, which wasn't long ago, had families and led otherwise ordinary lives. Many of the concentration camp guards would go into the concentration camp and commit terrible atrocities, then they'd go home and behave like normal parents and play with their children. What was the defensive operation that was going on that allowed this kind of massive splitting? So according to one of the major researchers in this area, Lifton, they were able to dissociate, they were able to numb themselves, they were able to blunt their feeling, and he suggested a mechanism called doubling, which was a mechanism whereby a person such as a Nazi doctor developed two selves. They had an Auschwitz self, which allowed them to go into the camp and do dreadful experiments on people, and then so function in the camp according to its values, and then go home and behave like an ordinary family man and have a normal family life. So the issue of psychological defenses is extremely important. Many of the Bosnian soldiers who participated in terrible murders and sexual assaults returned home and lived ordinary family lives. So it's possible for human beings to double, to split themselves into two functioning wholes, so that each part self acts as a kind of whole self. The individual's conscience then becomes split. Part of it becomes disconnected from his pre-war self, and in the case of the Nazi doctors, the conscience became attached to the ideals of the Nazis. Lifton called this a transfer of conscience, a transfer of conscience. I wanted to mention this just because it's very easy for us to fall into these kind of splitting defenses. I think I should stop at this point. Should we take a 5-minute break?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. 4 boxes. 2.